Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of In Conversation With. Today, we are joined by Dr. Amanda Heffernan, who's a senior lecturer in education at Manchester Institute of Education. Her research focuses on the contemporary challenges of school leaders' work and what that means for how we can better attract, support, and keep leaders within the profession. Amanda has a particular interest in leadership in complex school settings, including those in rural and remote areas, and the skills and knowledges that are needed to successfully lead in these contexts. Having previously worked at Monash University in Australia, Amanda is a former public school principal who now works with future and current leaders, policymakers, and international researchers to highlight the important and complex work of educational leadership today. We're delighted to be joined by Amanda. And so, Amanda, it's over to you.
Hi, Gavin. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk today. So I've prepared a little bit of a presentation that kind of draws together a number of different research projects that I've been working on in the last few years. And they're kind of helping me to have a better understanding, I suppose, of those issues of attracting and supporting and retaining principals or school leaders or head teachers, as I'm trying to get used to saying over here. And so, yeah, and then we'll just have a conversation about it, I guess, if that works for you. Okay, cool. So I've been thinking about the way we think about school leadership or school leaders' work. And I think one of the challenges that we face is that we often treat these issues in kind of siloed approaches. So we think about issues about, fewer people wanting to go into the role without really thinking about perhaps some of the more critical perspectives about why that might be. And so I wanted to break down some of these different ideas about why we might be struggling to really make sure that our school leaders are not only coming into the profession, but really thriving while they're in the profession. So, I'm going to talk about each of these things in turn and think about, the implications of that. So I've kind of highlighted each of these as being connected to a particular piece of research or a report or a publication that I've had in the last few years. And those are representative of bigger research projects, obviously. So the first one is a project that I did with the Australian Secondary Principals Association, and that is a public school organisation that represents principals right across the country in Australia. For those people who don't know, Australia's education system is quite a complex one because it's separated by states and territories, but then there's also a lot of federal oversight that takes kind of a how do we say it? Glenn Savage calls it like coercive federalism. So they encourage you to take a national approach through things like funding and targets that actually aren't related to the governance of education, which is a state priority. So with that in mind, we were talking to this association who represent principals right across the country who work in really different conditions of policy. And so we wanted to understand the kind of differences in the experiences of principals depending on where they lived and worked, because we felt like surely there must be some really good things happening in some places that, others could learn from as well. And so we did this study that looked at issues of autonomy and accountability for principals right across the country and tried to sort of, disaggregate some of the different policy conditions that we were seeing. But what we actually found was that even though the policy, was quite different and what autonomy meant in different places was quite different, other things were coming through much more that we weren't necessarily expecting to see quite as clearly as we did. And what we found in that project was that principals were really struggling right across the country. It didn't really matter what state or territory they were from or what context they were in. These issues kept coming up for them. So the really significant increase in the complexity of the role, the fact that it is a really messy role, you're kind of responsible for everything, accountable for everything increasingly more and more, and that there were some really big issues for people in our study around role clarity. So they were being told that they were responsible for particular things or autonomous in particular ways, but of course the reality of that was playing out very differently through, micromanaging or very restrictive formative targets and policies and practices that were happening in reality. And so because of that kind of concern that we were seeing around not really having a clear understanding of what decisions they were able to make and what decisions they were going to get kind of in trouble for making or be micromanaged after making, they found it really difficult at times to understand how they were supposed to respond to different issues in terms of them being urgent versus important. And we know that's not new. We've known that for many years for school leaders, having to have that balance of responding to things. But the issue was that they felt like they were constantly in crisis mode. So they would go to school, or even wake up and the adrenaline would start already really early in the morning. And they just felt like they were constantly reacting to things rather than being able to be proactive and long-term and really think about what they wanted for their schools in the long term. And that was some real concerns for people who, as you can imagine, that's not the kind of reasons they went into the role. That's not the work they wanted to be able to do. And it was also having really significant impacts on their long-term kind of plans to stay in the role. And I'll talk about that a little bit more soon. So as I said, we were really interested in this idea of autonomy. That was actually what started the project, because the president of the association and I were talking about the fact that he would talk to people, policymakers or politicians in different states, and they would say, but our principals are completely autonomous. They can do what they need for their local community. And as a principal himself, he would say, that's not accurate. But they needed the evidence to be able to kind of have that policy impact. And so what we found in relation to autonomy is that they had this promise of autonomy and the kind of theoretical ability to meet their local community's needs within a wider system, but that those systems were actually increasingly characterised by what principals told us felt like a lack of trust for them and their professional judgment. So there's a kind of colloquialism in Australian schools, certainly when I was a principal. It was the front page of the newspaper test. You'd have to think about big decisions that you were making as if, what would this look like if it ended up on the front page of the news tomorrow? And that kind of sense of being risk averse or being cautious about that public perception of what was happening seemed to be increasing for our principals. And they talked about that as a system thing. So the system was increasingly trying to avoid the public, I was going to say the word shaming. I don't know if that's the word, but that kind of public outrage that happens about schools, that seems to be increasing because it gets a lot of clicks in the media. And we know that people aren't as likely to write positive stories about teachers or teaching in the news. And so systems want to kind of avoid that risk. And so they start to really limit the sorts of decisions that schools can and can't make. One of the other things that we found also in relation to this kind of idea of autonomy was that alongside those promises of autonomy came a real decentralisation of any support for school leaders. And so they were, as you can imagine, having to take on a lot more of those systematic supports that should have been happening perhaps from other government departments that were being underfunded or unfunded, or from central support that should have been happening for schools that was now becoming the responsibility of school leaders as the accountable person in that school. So they talked about the kind of broader range of things that they did in their role, which ranged from everything from bringing in medical personnel to sort of sit within the school and have a school doctor, for example, which was quite unusual. All the way through to procuring legal support or employment support for community members or parents or carers, and working really closely with social services in ways that they hadn't before or that they hadn't had to before. And they also talked about the increase in needing to support their students and their communities with mental health care, and that being a really significant shift that they'd seen in the last few years. And while that's a really positive thing that people are seeking that support, as in many places around the world, it's a really underfunded area. And so a lot of that work was then being brought back into the school in ways that they felt that they hadn't really been appropriately prepared for, or didn't quite, know the most effective ways to support people in those respects. And one of the other things that people spoke about was all of the other parts of their job that weren't about teaching and learning. So when you look at a role description, it's kind of really emphasizing teaching and learning. And yet someone talked about the fact that this story really stuck with me. They had a car that drove into the school fence and it knocked down the sign at the front of the school, and they didn't have a centralized facilities team anymore. So their role became to source the contractors to fix the fence, to fix the sign. And they said it was a 10-month process where, like, a couple of days a week they were having to be on the phone to this person to follow up issues around the fence. And they were saying, like, my job has become about project management rather than about leading teaching and learning in the school, and I can't bear the thought of having to deal with this fence for a minute longer, which was really understandable. And then alongside all of that, there's that kind of policy tension or policy contradiction where in Australia we're still very much pursuing the school improvement focus, but over time other things have started to crop up into the policy. So there was a focus on wellbeing for students, which, as you can imagine from what I was saying about the importance of supporting kids with healthcare and mental health care and social services, was something that was really welcomed. But at the same time, where those things were coming up within the policy, it was improving student wellbeing as a means to improving student achievement. It wasn't about necessarily improving student wellbeing in and of itself. And so that was something that participants were really struggling with as they enacted those policies as well, trying to work out, well, what does that actually look like in practice if we're doing all of this with the aim towards improved student achievement? How do we actually think about wellbeing and what that might look like? So that's one kind of part of the puzzle, is that the role is just growing and growing and growing continuously. And for years we've been saying that the role is too big for one person to do, but the participants in this study were starting to really say this is too much for one person, and so we started to talk to them about things like, well, what kind of solutions would you propose? And well, a lot of it was that kind of more systematic stuff. So bringing back central support, letting me give these administrative things that I don't need to do back to someone else. There was conversations with people around things like job sharing and how they might be more flexible in their approaches towards leadership in what is still quite a conservative system, I think. So that's something that might be a fair way off, but is certainly something that people are starting to see as being a possibility. And so that kind of increase in the role expectations and the lack of clarity about the role really led to us starting to understand the idea of their work as being extended and intensified. So a lot of research talks about the intensification and extension of teachers' work and of leaders' work. And what we found in that study that I was just talking about was this idea about how people are actually looking after themselves. And so we kind of outright asked someone in an interview, like, how do you look after yourself? And they were really surprised that we had even asked that. So they're like, me? And we said, yeah, what do you do? And he said, I don't. I just don't. So the research tells us, and our research has shown, that at the end of the day, the person who kind of comes last in that priority or that very long working day is the principal or the school leader themselves. And so there's some real concerns for us around those questions of the health and wellbeing of school leaders. I know that there are concerns here in England as well. So Pat Thompson and her colleagues did a lot of work, really, really interesting work around leadership in COVID and through the pandemic, and kind of I know we're not post-pandemic, but in the kind of aftermath of the really bad part. And they raised similar concerns around these same issues. So, we know that it is an issue. It's not just happening down under, it's kind of happening in many places. And so the project I was going to talk about in relation to this more broadly was a study that I did with Neil Selwyn, who does a lot of work around the sociology of digital technologies and sociology of education. And we were talking about the fact that we did this project because we thought we would hear a lot about big picture things. So, how AI was changing schools, or how platforms that kind of manage, school management platforms were changing the work of principals. But when we started doing the interviews, the only thing people wanted to talk about was emails, because it was just the constant in their life. And so we kind of let go of this idea of talking about all this other stuff and really started to focus on what they were saying and feeling about the constant nature of emails in their work. And we thought this was a really good representation for these ideas of intensification and extension of their work, because as we know, as anyone who works really knows, emails mean that they are expected to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There were really clear expectations for some people in our study that they should be on emails all the time. So if they hadn't responded to emails from their supervisors or from central office or whoever, within a couple of hours, they would get a phone call to say, you should have responded to this. Well, as I talked about before, at the same time, the policy is saying, you should be out in classrooms, you should be doing learning walks, you should be focused on teaching and learning, not sitting in your office doing all of the mounting admin stuff that's happening to you. And so we heard a lot of really interesting and really, I guess, compelling and upsetting stories about the effects of emails in people's lives. They would talk about the feeling that they got when they heard the ping of their inbox. They would talk about the kind of feeling of surveillance, that there was someone constantly kind of checking up on them, and that everything they were doing was being monitored, and also, as you can imagine, that flowed on into their personal lives as well. So people would talk about, at first they'd say, no, I never work outside of normal working hours, and then they'd sort of tell us a story a little bit later on about, and I was just on my phone. I was just doing emails while I was at my kid's Christmas concert, and my wife was really frustrated with me because I wasn't paying attention. And so then we would have a conversation with them about, so you do work outside of your working hours, and they're like, but that's not work, that's just emails. And then there was also a really interesting kind of reflection from a lot of people about when they felt on top of their emails, or they felt like they had to keep on top of their emails to feel like they knew what was happening within their school. So there was a real sense of pressure to keep up with that constant flow of information, and it was almost for some people a way of managing the kind of pressures of leading a school, because they were able to know what was happening in every corner of their school, by communicating with people in that way. So it's not just emails. I feel like I should clarify. So when we're talking about the extension and intensification of work, there are any number of reasons that is happening. The sheer expectation that a school leader should be really present at everything. There's some really interesting research that talks about people's choices about what kind of school they want to go into leading, because they imagine perhaps that leading a primary school would have fewer out-of-hours commitments than leading a secondary school. And so these are kind of really big decisions that flow into the sorts of people who go into schools or school leadership. I was just reading some work in the last couple of weeks around attracting women leaders into the role, and that was one big thing. A lot of women in one of the studies I was reading talked about going into primary schools for that very reason, because they wanted to have fewer out of hours commitments. And so then that has an impact on the leaders that our young people see, and who is there to mentor teachers and support teachers and be part of those communities. So we also heard in that study about the kind of flow-on effects of health, or on health and well-being, of that pressure that leaders were feeling. So I mentioned already, they talked about the impact on personal relationships, and one of the other things was the ways that the pressure of the role translated into their ability to actually undertake that self-care. So the policy suggests, or the principal health and wellbeing policies might suggest exercise and sleeping well, and but people would talk about waking up at 3 a.m. and being unable to go back to sleep because they were so stressed and anxious about their work, or they would talk about one person had signed up to like a semester worth of yoga classes that started at 6 p.m. and they said they just never got there. The couple of times that they did get there, they finally managed to relax in the last 5 minutes of the class before it was over. And so the physical kind of manifestation of that pressure was having a really big impact on people in our study as well. And as you can imagine, then that had consequences for whether people felt that they could continue on, or how long they felt they could continue on in their work. And that kind of feeds into the next one, or the next way of thinking about it, that I think is really critical. And this is one that I do think is under discussed. We don't talk about this as much as we should, which is the emotional side of work, and that kind of affective side. So the side that you feel within your body, the kind of bodily embodiment of the pressures, and but also the joys of the role. It does go both ways. So for this section, I wanted to talk about this paper that I wrote with Martin Mills, who was at UCL in London and is now back in Australia. And we did a study looking specifically at issues of attraction and retention in school leaders in England and Australia. And we used one of your colleagues, I believe, Gavin, Kathleen Lynch's affective labour framework. So she talks about these three elements of affective labour, which is love, care, and solidarity. And so we use that framework to start to think through some of the different aspects of people's work. So we heard from participants, and I've heard this across a few studies, this particular word is that the role is a burden. There's a weight of responsibility that people feel as a school leader. And, we know that that's because they've been responsibilised for so many things for so long, but that it does weigh really heavily on them. And so we heard about all of these different kinds of emotions that people felt every day. We weren't asking about this. Again, it's kind of like the emails, but it just kept coming through in our interviews with people. So they talked about the different feelings that they had as part of their role, and that really jumped out at us. And we heard about feelings right across the spectrum. So there was, rage at systems that were letting down their communities. There was the joy that they felt within the work when they were able to achieve what they had hoped to, a sense of pride. Perhaps for some, there was a sense of shame when they were making decisions that didn't sit comfortably with their kind of motivations and what they wanted their role to really be about. And so we wanted to understand that a little bit more in depth, I guess. And so we found that this framework really let us do that. So the sense of solidarity gave us a way to understand the different reasons that people went into particular schools or into the profession in general. That is the idea that you are working for people that you don't necessarily have a relationship with or know. So you're going in to make a difference for kids that you don't yet have those connections with. And then the next level is the care. So the caring relationships that you have with your students, with staff members, with community members. And we also found that level was really important in terms of leaders networks, that they got a lot of that really nourishing, important kind of care work from working with colleagues who were in similar positions, who understood what they were going through, and that were able to empathise with them, and vice versa. I've just seen a typo in here, which I'm horrified by, because it really makes quite a difference to what I'm saying. So the final one that we thought was really important and is underdeveloped, I think, in the literature, is the impact that the role actually has on leaders' lives, on the relationships with the people in their lives who are in those kind of really close parts of their circles, I guess. So their children, their partners, their parents. And we heard about people who were so exhausted after giving so much all day, every day in their work, that they would come home and couldn't hug their kids or couldn't hug their partner because they just couldn't bear to give any more to anyone else. We also heard some really powerful stories from people about their parents, their relationship with their parents, and how they were shaped by their work. So a number of people told us that losing a parent had a really significant impact on how they, it was one of those catalyst moments, like, what am I doing with my life? What do I want to do with my life? Is this the job that I really want to keep doing? And there was also a sense for some of our participants that the pride that they knew that their parents felt about them becoming school leaders was a real motivating factor in continuing on in a really, really difficult job or in really difficult circumstances. And really sadly, we also heard a lot of discussions about relationship breakdowns as a result of the pressures of the role. And so we kind of highlighted in this paper that the support that people are getting, obviously, for the emotional part of their role is really insufficient. So as I said, they're often drawing that support from networks with other leaders in similar positions. And you can imagine that also, in some ways, while it's giving something to them, it's also taking something from them. So they're having to kind of go and do more of that emotional work as they do that connecting or supporting of people who are going through similarly difficult circumstances. So we argued in this paper that this is something that really actually needs systemic support and systemic attention to make a real difference for people. So yeah, I think this is one of the things that, Jill Blackmore obviously has written about emotional labour really in depth for many, many years. So there are, I'm not saying we were the first ones to come up with this, but I think we did really feel that there isn't enough attention paid to this aspect of the role, because it's such a key thing to help you, sustain who you are and be able to see yourself continuing on for a certain period of time. So I also think it's worth talking about in terms of attraction and retention. We still have really limited ideas about who should be a school leader. And so for this idea, I wanted to draw upon this project that I've been doing with Pat Thompson from the University of Nottingham for a number of years, where we've used women's wardrobes as a way in to kind of think about their identities as school leaders, their aspirations as school leaders, and more broadly, our kind of understanding of professionalism in school leadership. So at first we were really curious about how wardrobe kind of helped women step into the role, because we had both been school principals and we were talking about, we both had a special blazer, or Jill Blackmore had written about the power of red lipstick, and Pat has written before about these special boots that she had that made her feel like she could kind of take on the world. And so there was, obviously for us, a little bit of a connection between the outward appearance and that sense of confidence or sense of who we were as leaders when we kind of put on the uniform of being a leader. And we found that wasn't just us, as you can imagine. It was a really kind of widespread phenomenon, and people told us about the importance of the blazer. We wrote a chapter about the blazer as a suit of armor. When they had a difficult meeting or whatever, they'd kind of put on their blazer and it would make them feel a little bit more like they could go in and face what was happening. But we also found that through these discussions about wardrobe, what really came through was how restricted our sense of what a professional leader looks like or is, still is. And so as part of that kind of sense of it being restricted was restricting people from feeling like they could actually take on that role. So people who didn't fit within a particular mold, people who were older was a really significant one that we heard about, but also people who were didn't necessarily fit that appearance of a leader, which was very much suited and booted, quite conservative. We heard about one person, for example, who was a punk, self-described as a punk, had like a really cool kind of asymmetrical haircut and made their own clothes, was really, really fashionable in that way, and just couldn't secure the position. So had been a deputy for a number of years and couldn't make that final step. And then over Christmas got a bob and bought a suit and got the job. And so, nothing else about them had changed other than their appearance. And so that kind of sent a really clear message about what was accepted and expected of leaders. And we know from our research, but also from the literature, that there are enduring issues of sexism, racism, homophobia, ableism, ageism, and I've said and more. There's so much more also in the literature about who is seen as fitting the role of a school leader and who is kind of excluded from that. And we've highlighted that as being something that's really important, because there's all this kind of discourse about the importance of diversity and the importance of thinking differently as school leaders. But if we just keep hiring the same people again and again and again, what is that actually, how is that really ever going to be achieved? And in this paper that we wrote last year, we found a really interesting trend within participants that as they got further on in their careers, they started to push back against those expectations more and more. They felt, this was their word, not our word, they felt much more authentic in their leadership. They had much more confidence that their work could speak for itself. And so they started to bring some more of their own personalities back into their appearance as leaders. And that was, everything from wearing really bright and colourful clothes that one person talked about doing an interview with a dress with seagulls all over it. And she sort of looked at herself in the mirror or the camera on Zoom and thought, are they actually going to give me this job? And they did, because she was so confident in who she was and her vision as a leader. And so we didn't know for sure, but we suspect that this is a kind of a combination of, as women were aging, they were kind of just thinking, oh, I'm not going to keep suppressing, who I am for the rest of my career. But also, as I said, they got much more confident in the fact that their leadership could speak for itself. Alongside that, they felt much more secure in their careers or in less precarious positions than they were when they were having to kind of fit those particular norms. But one really interesting part of it was also people describing the effects of having had to work from home. And someone said, I had my Zoom set up perfectly, so it looked like I was in an office, and then my kids just started running around behind me and screaming, and I was like, well, the facade is gone now. There's no way I can pretend to be this kind of corporate person. And so they felt like they were able to just be themselves, and it was a kind of a humanizing moment. But we also suspect there's still, even though there's a long way to go, still some changing ideas, and we're kind of evolving and becoming more accepting very, very slowly about who can and can't be a school leader. And then the last part that I wanted to talk about, and I'm conscious that I've just been talking rather than conversing, is that as we know, there are fewer and fewer people that really want to go on to be a school leader these days. So in a follow-up project to the Australian Secondary Principals one that I talked about first, last year we finished up a study that was specifically looking at issues of attraction and retention. And we spoke with aspiring, current and former leaders to understand those kind of 3 different perspectives on the role. And the aspiring leaders were increasingly really unlikely to want to step up into the principal position, because they saw all of the things I've been talking about. They saw that the workload was massive and it wasn't something that they were willing to commit to. They saw and spoke the most to us about the emotional side of things and that kind of intensity of the types of work that they were having to do. They felt that the role had become too politicized and that there wasn't support for principals in making the decisions that they had to make. And so they were just saying, I'm happy where I am. I don't need to, I've got influence. I've got the ability to make changes and make a difference now. I don't need to do that next level of work. And it's not worth it to me. We also thought it was really interesting about, we asked current principals, would you recommend to other people that they take on this job? And only less than 20% were like, yes, I definitely would. And the rest of them were either completely unsure or just wouldn't answer, or 43% of them said either definitely not or probably not. So there's one of the people in our focus group said they have an advertising problem because they're not making the role look particularly inviting to anyone, because they're going through such difficult times themselves. And so they said there's a lot more work to be done in encouraging people to take it on. And this is where it becomes really interesting, I think, or tricky, because alongside all of that is the fact that their satisfaction in their work was still really high. In both of those studies where we actually collected, numbers about people, about their work, the levels of satisfaction were extremely positive. You can see here 96% of people were really positive about the rewards of their work. So 60% of those people said they strongly agreed that their work is rewarding. The phrase we hear the most often is that it's the best job in the world when it's going well, when you're at the top of the roller coaster, and that's the thing that keeps people coming back. So when they actually are able to do that work that they went into the role to do, they love the job. It's giving them that kind of sense of fulfillment and satisfaction and happiness and joy that that does sustain you. But the issue is that increasingly is not happening because they're being taken away from that kind of core focus and doing all of the other stuff. But the reason that they keep coming back is because they really feel either that they are making a difference and they can see that they're making a difference, or that they have the potential to make a difference. So I think that's the really tricky thing, because policymakers have often sort of said, they might be unhappy, or they're saying that they're stressed, but they're still, we're not losing that many people from the job. But the issue is that the job is making them unwell, that it's having these really significant negative impacts on their work. But because they keep coming back for their students or their staff or the positives, it does make it, I think it kind of hides the stuff that we don't talk about enough about the work that they do. And so, I think that's part of our work, I guess, is that to kind of raise the awareness of those struggles, that they're either not able to talk about themselves, or that they don't feel comfortable talking about themselves as well. So I think that's the end of my presentation. But I think that thinking about all of those things in connection is really, really critical if we're going to actually think seriously about how we can make a difference in terms of better supporting people or bringing them into the role into the future.
Amanda, thanks a million. That was, just very illuminating, slightly worrying as well. But I guess it's important that we do unpack sometimes these hidden facets that people experience in whether it's phenomenologically or just simple lived experience, because I guess, school principals still suffer from this view that people have of teachers having lengthy summer holidays. So it's not that bad then. And your research program has just shown here how complexly bad it can be for people and the challenges that they even have of articulating that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also, in some ways, I think sometimes people feel bad about articulating that. So a lot of the reflections can be kind of couched in the, I know other people have a much more difficult circumstance, or like my teachers work so hard, or and then they'll, tell us a story that makes us kind of clutch at our chests, and it's just another part of the everyday for them. I think that kind of metaphor of the frog in the boiling water, like you don't realize how bad it is until it's almost too late sometimes. So because they're constantly on the go, and the kind of I guess the kind of people that take on that role are very often very capable and just get stuff done. It's often until they actually have to stop for a reason or pause or whatever that then they realize that things are too bad, and it's almost too late by that point to fix it and get them back into it.
Well, one of the things I've noticed in doing some of my own research, particularly interviews, is that afterwards principals, predominantly often will say, thanks so much. I've never had the opportunity to speak like this before. Methodologically, maybe in educational leadership, there's something we could look into in that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's also a real, in some of those really risk-averse systems, principals are not allowed to speak out about the challenges that they face. So one principal described us as their intellectual whistleblower. Like they said, we can't say this stuff, so you need to say, you need to make people aware of this. And I think, Pat Thompson wrote that great article a few years ago about the different methods that we use in educational leadership, and we really rely on the same few things again and again. And so I do really agree there's some work that we could potentially do to, bring other ways of asking questions into our work, or to have a different focus in what we focus on in educational leadership research.
Can I just ask, Amanda, as we're on the topic of methodology, in your research on women's wardrobes with Pat Thompson, did you use visual methods, the wardrobe as a visual method, or was it a metaphor, or how did you go about that?
So a little bit of both, and we have plans to get much more creative into the future. We had a few people bring in almost like memory box work. So people would bring photos of themselves at different points in their career. Someone brought their staff photo, where you get all the staff to line up in it, and they kind of could point themselves out immediately as being the one that was slightly different than the uniform of grey and navy suits. There's we feel that there's a lot more scope for that creative approach. And I think now that we're in the same country and on the same time zone, we might be able to do a little bit more of that development in that area. But Pat's, the queen of creative research methods. So she's definitely the person to be working with on something like that for sure.
She's so inspiring. Yeah. Some of your final slides, Amanda, kind of talked a little bit around the question of attraction and why some people don't necessarily now want to go into the principalship. Is there a problem, and this is something I think that maybe I've observed in my own context as well, of people wanting to go so far along the leadership pathway, but not accede to the principalship? In other words, we have this glut of middle leaders, deputy principals, many of whom will say, this is it now for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Where in Australia, at least, we were seeing that increasingly more and more. And we did some focus groups with senior people within different systems. And that was something that they raised as a concern, is that, it's always described as the pipeline. The pipeline has kind of cut off in a lot of places. As you say, they see it and they go, all right, I'm done now. This is where I'm going to kind of stay for the rest of my career. And so there's some consideration then about, well, how do you make sure that future leaders have different experiences without kind of discounting the work that current middle leaders are doing if they don't want to move up? To take on that principal role, often you have to be able to show you've done similar kinds of work or whatever. So how do we think a little bit more differently about how we select and prepare and kind of nurture future leaders who would want to go into that role as well? But I do think, though, if we fixed or could address a lot of those issues, then that blockage would disappear. People are only stopping because they can't bear the thought of working 7 days a week, every week of the year, or they see the emotional toll that it takes, or the kind of work that they would be asked to do. So I think if those things could be more appropriately addressed, it kind of takes care of that issue in many ways.
Obviously, this kind of, I guess, goes back to, in a way, some of your work has looked at principals in the role and the challenges therein, but I suppose to design policy then, touching on your initial point of the lack of role clarity, possibly we can take that research evidence base you've shared, but also work with potential aspirant principals and say, how do we reimagine, how do we co-produce more clarity on what sustainable principalship looks like?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there, as I said, I was reading some work about aspiring women leaders, and part of that was also around the fact that we really haven't changed the way we select and hire principals for decades now. There's kind of tweaks around the edges, but we're not at a point where big systems are thinking differently about any of these things. It's kind of, they're reproducing the same way we've always done things. So I think there is definitely a need for policymakers to really think about, okay, what are the real issues? And they're not, we know as critical researchers that we're not giving easy answers. And so of course that makes it harder. None of this is easily fixable or easily solved. It really does take kind of ground up rethinking and rebuilding of the role.
I suppose a lot of what we've been speaking about over the past few minutes has been about trying to encourage more people with some tweaks systemically, etc., to step up. But much of your research might also explain why increasingly we're seeing a trend in people stepping down. Is that a global trend, Amanda, as well?
I think so. I think what we're seeing is we're not at the point where a lot of people are yet stepping down. People are kind of having to stop due to illness or due to ill health, but they're still not, that either doesn't get talked about. People disappear and you kind of go, oh, they retired or whatever. I think we're getting towards a point where it will become a real concern. But people in our study with teachers too, we've done similar work with teachers where they've said, I would leave if I could, but I can't, so I have to keep going. And that's the other real concern, is that people in education can't always see how transferable their skills really are, which, means they're not leaving. But until it's the same with teacher shortages, they're only really starting to get concerned about teacher shortages in Australia because it's starting to hit the really big city schools that normally never had a problem. And so rural and remote schools had been screaming for years, we cannot fully staff our school, we cannot get specialist teachers out here. But there was always a sense of, well, that's because you're in a rural area. So now that it's become an issue in city schools, it's become much more of a concern. And I think similar things will start to happen for in that question, those questions around leadership, is that the more we start to realise that this is happening and that people are stopping or ready to stop or would stop if they could, then we'll start to address it really seriously. But I think there is an incoming, I don't know the word I'm looking for, but it's going to reach a tipping point at some point, and we just don't know when that will be. But I think COVID has probably sped that up. Because of the pressures that people have. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and possibly that's an area of work in terms of education, full stop. We need to explore a little more about how that's going to shape future professionalism or work engagement, persistence, all that kind of thing. Yeah,
absolutely. We did a really interesting study when I was at Monash before coming to England, and we talked about we did work with a representative sample of the Australian public about the impact of online learning and of learning at home during COVID, and people were really open to doing things differently because they were forced to. So a huge number of people said they would be much more open than they were before COVID to the thought of having schooling be more flexible, of, having a blended approach to schooling and all of those sorts of things. But we did caution in the report that that can't just be added onto teachers' workloads, that it would necessitate that kind of rethinking or reimagining of what a teacher's role might look like as well. Because at the moment, we hear teachers aren't trusted to work from home. Even if they have a day of, like, a planning day with no classes, they're expected to be on campus because that's just what we expect of teachers. And so, yeah, I think we need to rethink the flexibility in the way we expect teachers to work.
The final question I have for you, Amanda, touches on the point you make about emotions and affect. And I know you've recently written a scoping review in this area as well. So I guess I'm just wondering, where to next for that area of research in educational leadership? Because it seems like it's really promising and can tell us a lot about the lived experience, the future even of the role.
Yeah. It's really interesting. So the scoping review did show us that the work is being done in silos. So there was a lot of work in psychology that wasn't being read by educational, leadership people, for example, and vice versa. And it's the trick of, if you write about school leaders, people think it's leadership work, or, without kind of going into that whole field defining stuff. But we felt that there was a lot of work that had not really been picked up as much as it could have been or should have been, I guess, because there is this kind of, not necessarily split, but there's such different focuses in our fields and in education more generally. So the work that I've been doing has not given the answers that people need. I haven't gone and said, here are the 10 things to do to fix the emotional work of school leaders. And that work might need to be done, but I don't know if it's going to be done by me. But I think there really is a need for the so what or what now, and that's something that school leaders have said to us as well. Of we've done a million surveys. We just keep doing, we keep talking about the same things over and over to researchers, but when is it going to actually make a difference in our lives, and when are we going to see the translation of that? So I think part of the problem is that we're not giving policymakers easy answers. That's always part of a problem for education research, I think. But I think there is some really interesting potential for kind of moving beyond critique. So I think Michael Apple talked about it a few years ago, is that we need to move beyond critique. Critique is not enough anymore. We need to start actually offering different futures to people through the work that we do. And that's something that I'm really thinking about in terms of the policy relevance of our work, the relevance for practitioners of our work, and how we find that balance of asking the really difficult, critical questions, but also having something, I don't know if practical, but useful to school leaders come out of it as well. And I was part of a study that is as yet unpublished, but we're working on that looked at some of the different structures that were actually available to support leaders with that emotional side of their work. And they were really effective, and that's why we're trying to kind of get it out as quickly as we can, because they made a difference to people. So they had these, without going into too much detail, they had a particular way of networking and creating support groups for leaders that the participants described them as saving their lives. And I think that was so powerful that kind of work could be scaled up and invested in. So, yeah, I feel like that was a very vague answer because I can't talk about something that's not published yet. But I think there is potential for us kind of translating what we do into that kind of next steps.
Well, Amanda, it sounds great. And it's really positive to end on that point of asking challenging, difficult, critical questions, but trying to be generative in our responses. And to reflect that lived experience, which is really a hallmark of your work, and why it's been so great to speak to you today. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And I'm really happy to have been able to talk to you about this stuff.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Gavin.